New York, the epicenter of the pandemic, this is Democracy Now! With the largest one-day death toll in the U.S. yet, 2,400 in just 24 hours, an average 100 deaths an hour, the highest one-day total for any nation since the start of the pandemic. President Trump wages a war on public health experts and science, threatening to cut World Health Organization funding and fueling a theory that the coronavirus originated from a Wuhan lab. China's pushing back.
China's position on the origin and means of transmission of the novel coronavirus is clear. We will always believe this is a scientific issue, which should be studied by scientists and medical experts.
We'll speak to a zoologist who's been sounding the alarm about a coming pandemic for years. Then to India, where officials say 6 major cities are coronavirus hotspots, including the capital city, New Delhi. We'll go there to speak with writer and activist Arundhati Roy, who says the pandemic is a portal.
Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It's a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The White House is unveiling new guidelines today aimed at rolling back state stay-at-home orders protecting against the spread of the coronavirus. President Trump's call to wind down social distancing came as the United States recorded more than 2,400 deaths in just 24 hours, the highest one-day death total for any nation since the start of the pandemic.
The battle continues, but the data suggests that nationwide we have passed the peak on new cases.
Across the United States, there are over 644,000 confirmed cases of COVID-19, though the true number is far higher due to a critical shortage of tests. More than 28,500 people have died of the disease nationwide in just a matter of weeks. Despite that, President Trump said some states could begin relaxing social distancing restrictions before the end of April. The plan has drawn intense fire from medical professionals and even corporate executives tapped by Trump to advise on reopening the economy. They said Wednesday far more testing needs to be in place before workers can return to factories, schools, stores, and office spaces. They spoke with President Trump in a conference call. This week, researchers at the Harvard School of Public Health warned that unless a vaccine becomes widely available, social distancing may have to extend until 2022 to prevent a surge of COVID-19 cases that could break the U.S. healthcare system. The Labor Department is set to announce weekly unemployment figures, with economists estimating at least 5 million U.S. workers filed jobless claims in just the last 7 days. That could bring the number of unemployment claims over the past month to well over 22 million. On Wednesday, millions of U.S. taxpayers began receiving payments of $1,200 plus $500 per dependent child. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin said in late March the one-time payments would be enough to tide over Americans for months.
I think the entire package provides economic relief overall for about 10 weeks.
Some Democratic lawmakers are pushing for far more direct assistance to U.S. households during the crisis. The Emergency Money for the People Act would provide all but the highest-earning U.S. citizens age 16 and over $2,000 a month until unemployment falls to pre-coronavirus levels. In California, Governor Gavin Newsom Wednesday announced a $125 million relief fund for undocumented immigrants left jobless by the pandemic. Meanwhile, a congressional committee reports tax provisions in the coronavirus stimulus passed by Congress last month will overwhelmingly benefit the wealthiest Americans. 4 out of 5 tax filers benefiting from the $70 billion temporary tax loophole are millionaires or billionaires. They'll receive an average windfall of $1.6 million, dwarfing the $1,200 payments for working Americans. Here in New York, the epicenter of the pandemic, over 11,500 people have died of COVID-19. Governor Andrew Cuomo said that beginning Friday, all New Yorkers will be required to wear face coverings in public when social distancing is not possible. Mayor Bill de Blasio introduced a $170 million plan to provide food aid to New Yorkers increasingly at risk of going hungry. De Blasio said over 200 New York City residents are dying in their homes each day, with the vast majority of those deaths due to COVID-19. In the small town of Andover, New Jersey, police discovered the bodies of 17 people stuffed in a small morgue at one of the state's largest nursing homes after receiving an anonymous tip. At least 68 recent deaths have been linked to that Andover subacute and rehabilitation center. Medical workers at hospitals around the United States held a National Day of Action Wednesday demanding an end to the preventable healthcare worker deaths from COVID-19. At the Kingsbrook Jewish Medical Center in Brooklyn, where 5 medical workers have died and several others remain hospitalized, protesters stood at least 6 feet apart as they demanded more personal protective equipment. This is Arlene Mertens, a patient care technician at Kingsbrook.
That's all we're asking. Give us what we need so we can survive, to continuously help those who need us and continuously keep people alive.
Workers are also demanding better safety training, better staffing levels, temporary housing for workers who risk spreading disease to their family members. In Lansing, Michigan, thousands of protesters flooded the streets around the state capitol building in their cars Wednesday and defied a state ban on public gatherings to demand an end to Michigan's quarantine measures. The protest was organized by the Michigan Conservative Coalition under the hashtag Operation Gridlock. One large group of men armed with assault rifles posed for a picture on the steps of the Capitol, holding signs reading "Trump Pence" and "Remove the Whitmer regime." Inside the Capitol, Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer said the protesters risked spreading disease and blasted them for blocking access to a hospital where an ambulance was unable to discharge a patient.
I support your right to free speech, and I respect your opinions. I just urge you, don't put yourself at risk, and don't put others at risk either.
In Frankfort, Kentucky, dozens of protesters shouted through a window of the state capitol building Wednesday, interrupting Governor Andy Beshear as he held a coronavirus press briefing. In Mexico, a massive campaign to recruit more medical staff has been launched as the country faces an alarming shortage of healthcare workers. However, reports emerged of hundreds of applicants being rejected after standing in line for hours to apply for jobs. Elsewhere in Mexico, dozens of workers from an assembly factory in Ciudad Juarez, owned by the U.S.-based company Regal, held a protest Wednesday demanding the factory shut down over safety concerns. The protest followed the death of a worker who presenting with COVID-19 symptoms. This is factory worker Isabel Flores.
We are scared for our health and the health of our children because we all have families, all of us here, and they just look at us as a business. They don't care if we die.
The French Navy has evacuated its flagship nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, the Charles de Gaulle, where nearly 700 sailors have tested positive for coronavirus. On Wednesday, France sharply revised its COVID-19 death toll upwards to more than 17,000 as nursing homes reported hundreds of additional deaths over Easter weekend. But for the first time since the start of the pandemic, French hospitals saw the total number of patients decrease. Sweden saw a sharp rise in COVID-19 19 cases Wednesday, Swedish authorities have refused calls to close restaurants, retail stores, and classes for primary and junior high school students, even as coronavirus deaths far outpace those in other Scandinavian countries with strict lockdowns. In Germany, Chancellor Angela Merkel has extended a nationwide lockdown until May 3rd, but will ease some restrictions, citing a fragile, partial success in fighting the coronavirus. Unlike the United States, Germany began testing early and often for the disease and has a much lower death rate. Back in the United States, the privately owned Otay Mesa Detention Center near San Diego has become the U.S. immigration jail with the largest coronavirus outbreak, as at least 17 immigrant prisoners have tested positive for COVID-19 as of Tuesday, according to documents obtained by the San Diego Union Tribune. In Tacoma, Washington, immigrants imprisoned at the Northwest Detention Center have launched another hunger strike, the third in just 3 weeks. Prisoners held a protest Wednesday in the facility's yard, forming the letters SOS with their bodies as they continue to demand their release. Meanwhile, a federal magistrate judge in Miami has ordered Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, to disclose how many of its third-party contractors have tested positive for COVID-19. ICE reportedly hid this information as the agency claimed third-party contractors were not considered staff. In related news, COVID-19 cases continue to multiply at the Cook County Jail in Chicago, with individuals held in the jail's medical unit especially vulnerable to contagion. In newly published phone interviews recorded by the Southside Weekly newspaper, 6 prisoners describe worsening health and sanitary conditions and a loss of access to their routine medical care.
It's hard to stay away from each other because we're in a dorm and it's 39 people. And, you know, there's a lot of guys coughing and, you know, got a fever, and it's like you got to be damn near dying for them to get medical attention.
In Pennsylvania, 67-year-old prisoner Rudolph Sutton died of COVID-19 on Saturday, just 3 days before Philadelphia prosecutors were set to review his claims he was wrongfully imprisoned for a 1988 murder. Sutton's case was backed by the Innocence Project, which concluded a 5-year investigation that Sutton was likely innocent. Sutton had been serving a life sentence at the SCI Phoenix jail. Meanwhile, rumors circulated online that internationally renowned political prisoner Mumia Abu-Jamal, held at SCI Mahanoy prison in Pennsylvania, was hospitalized with a headache and trouble breathing. But supporters with the campaign to bring Mumia home reached him Wednesday, and he said the rumors are not true.
You heard that I was hospitalized. It is not true. In fact, I haven't been up medical for about a month. I usually go up 3 times a week. As I said in a recent commentary, everybody's locked down. And you get 23 hours in the cell. And then that last 24th hour, 45 minutes out of the cell. You can take a shower, you can get a bucket and then swab your decks and mop your cell, or you can call people on the phone, or you can plug up your tablet to the kiosk. But you're not leaving the block. And they only started yard about a week ago. And that's one 45-minute period every 3 days. So everybody in the state is locked down, just like everybody in the United States is locked down.
That was prisoner Mumia Abu-Jamal, well-known journalist, speaking with Professor Johanna Fernandez, denying claims that he was in a hospital with COVID-19. In South Dakota, a Smithfield Foods meatpacker has died of COVID-19 amidst the largest single coronavirus hotspot in the U.S. 64-year-old Agustin Rodriguez passed away Tuesday morning after spending 2 weeks on a ventilator. He was one of 640 workers at the Sioux Falls Smithfield pork factory who have tested positive for COVID-19. Most of them are refugees and immigrants from around the world. Smithfield said this week it will also close plants in Wisconsin and Missouri after workers there tested positive. Other major slaughterhouses have closed due to the virus, including a Tyson pork plant in Iowa and a JBS beef plant in Colorado. In Florida, all residents and employees of the exclusive Fisher Island private luxury community are receiving serological serological tests for coronavirus antibodies, even though such tests are not yet available for the general public. Fisher Island consistently ranks as one of the wealthiest zip codes in the United States. On Wednesday, 10 African-American pastors from across the United States held an online news conference to demand equity in testing, warning communities of color are suffering the most from the virus while receiving the lowest per capita rate of COVID-19 tests. In New Jersey, Rutgers University researchers Wednesday began administering the first saliva-based test for the novel coronavirus. For patients, taking the test is as simple as spitting into a test tube. For healthcare workers, it's far safer to administer since it no longer requires close contact with patients during nose and mouth swabs. Massachusetts Senator and former presidential candidate Elizabeth Warren has endorsed Joe Biden for president. Senator Warren made the announcement in a video posted online Wednesday morning. In the evening, she spoke with MSNBC's Rachel Maddow.
If he asked you to be his running mate, would you say yes?
Yes.
In international news, in South Korea, President Moon Jae-in's left-leaning governing party won over half of seats in South Korea's parliamentary elections Wednesday, which saw the highest voter turnout in a parliamentary election in nearly 30 years. South Korea is the first country to hold nationwide elections since the coronavirus pandemic began. In climate news, a new study confirms a record amount of Greenland's ice sheet melted in the summer of 2019. The study says the dramatic loss of ice was due to atmospheric circulation patterns that had not been taken into account by previous climate models and that may be significantly underestimating future melting. A U.S. judge has revoked a crucial permit needed to complete the disputed Keystone XL oil pipeline, citing the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers' failure to adequately consider the effects on endangered species inhabiting rivers in the pipeline's path and ignoring guidelines of the Endangered Species Act. The ruling, however, does not shut down the pipeline's construction currently underway at the U.S.-Canada border in Montana. And in Baltimore, a transgender woman has been violently killed in what is believed to be the sixth murder of a transgender or gender nonconforming person this year in the U.S. Johanna Metzger was reportedly stabbed while visiting Baltimore from Pennsylvania this weekend. A virtual memorial was held in her honor Monday. In related news, the American Civil Liberties Union and Legal Voice filed a federal lawsuit Wednesday challenging a new anti-trans law in Idaho that bans transgender women from competing in women's sports. The group says the law violates Title IX, the historic statute that bans sex discrimination in education. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. When we come back, what are zoonotic diseases? We'll look at the possible origins of the coronavirus with a zoologist who studies diseases that cross the animal-human divide. Stay with us. The musicians of the National Orchestra of France, playing together alone in their homes. Yes, playing together Bolero by Ravel. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman here in New York, the epicenter of the pandemic, with my co-host Nermeen Sheikh, usually sitting right here at my side, but joining us from her home to keep us all safe and stop community spread. Hi, Nermeen.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world.
Well, we're going to begin right away with our first segment. The White House is unveiling new guidelines today aimed at rolling back states' stay-at-home orders, protecting against the spread of coronavirus. President Trump's call to wind down social distancing came as the United States recorded more than 2,400 deaths in just 24 hours, the highest one-day death toll for any nation since the start of the pandemic. Across the United States, there are nearly 640,000 confirmed cases of COVID-19, though the true number is likely far higher due to the critical shortage of tests. At least 31,000 people have died of the disease in just a matter of weeks. Despite this, President Trump spent the last few days waging a war on journalists, public health experts, and science. On Wednesday, Trump suggested without evidence that World Health Organization officials conspired to hide the truth about the coronavirus. His comments came one day after he announced the U.S. would begin withholding hundreds of millions of dollars of funding for the UN body. At the same news briefing, President Trump fueled the fringe theory promoted by Fox News that the virus came from a lab in Wuhan, China. This is Fox News reporter John Roberts questioning Trump at Wednesday's press briefing.
Mr. President, multiple sources are telling Fox News today that the United States government now has high confidence that while the coronavirus is a naturally occurring virus, it emanated from a virology lab in Wuhan, that because of lax safety protocols, an intern was infected, who later infected her boyfriend, and then went to the wet market in Wuhan, where it began to spread. Does that correspond with what you have heard from officials?
Well, I don't want to say that, John, but I will tell you more and more we're hearing the story, and we'll see. When you say multiple sources, now there's a case where you can use the word sources, but we are doing a very thorough examination of this horrible situation that happened.
This came just one day after the Pentagon's top general, Mark Milley, said the coronavirus likely came from natural sources, not a Chinese lab. On Thursday, China's foreign ministry spokesperson responded.
China's position on the origin and means of transmission of the novel coronavirus is clear. We will always believe this is a scientific issue, which should be studied by scientists and medical experts. I would like to remind you, the head of WHO has repeatedly said there's no evidence that the coronavirus was made in a lab. Many well-known medical experts in the world also believe that claims of the so-called laboratory leaks have no scientific basis.
The scientific journal The Lancet has said the virus seems to have come from wildlife. Well, for more on the origins of the coronavirus, Trump's response, and where we go from here, we're joined by a zoologist who has long studied diseases that cross the animal-human divide, and who for years has been sounding the alarm about a coming pandemic. Dr. Peter Daszak is with us. He's a disease ecologist, the president of EcoHealth Alliance, a nonprofit that works globally to identify and study our vulnerabilities to emerging infectious disease. EcoHealth Alliance has been studying coronaviruses in China since the end of the SARS outbreak in 2004. This coronavirus is really called SARS-2. He's joining us from the Hudson River Valley in New York. Welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. So if you can unpack what we just heard, it goes to the issue of the origins of the coronavirus. Especially interesting that President Trump is raising this now as he's being seriously attacked for the United States' lack of action and delay. And so he is striking out at as many sectors as he can. But talk about the origins of the coronavirus, Dr. Daszak.
Yeah, great to be here. Look, first, the idea that this virus escaped from the lab is just pure baloney. It's simply not true. I've been working with that lab for 15 years, and the samples collected were collected by me and others in collaboration with our Chinese colleagues. They're some of the best scientists in the world. There was no viral isolate in the lab. There was no cultured virus that's anything related to SARS coronavirus 2, so it's just not possible. And like you say, it's really a politicization of the origins of a pandemic, and it's really unfortunate. The stories, as President Trump said he's been hearing, have been around since day one of the outbreak. And they're around in every outbreak. Every single outbreak of a novel virus, somebody somewhere says, well, this has been manufactured in a lab. In fact, I a few weeks ago when this started circulating, I Googled HIV is man-made. Do it yourself and see. There are people out there who still believe this is a bioengineered virus that's spread around the world. It's just really unfortunate. And I don't really know why these conspiracy theories get such traction. I think that people just have trouble understanding what's going on the planet. We've been studying the origin of emerging diseases. About 75% of every new emerging disease, think about Ebola, H1N1 flu, H5N1 flu, these pandemic viruses that emerge originate in wildlife. Every species of wildlife carries viruses that are a natural part of its biology, a bit like we have the common cold and herpes, cold sores. They don't really do much to the species in the wild. But sometimes when we make contact with them, we pick up those viruses and they can be lethal. Most times they're not, but every now and again we get a lethal virus. We estimate there are 1.7 million unknown viruses in wildlife. So there's a lot of diversity out there that could emerge in the future. And really, we need to be looking at that instead of pointing fingers for political gain at scientists who are working to benefit public health. The scientists in those labs are right now, today, working to see if vaccines and drugs will kill the coronavirus to save our lives. This sort of battle doesn't help in a pandemic.
Dr. Dasha, could you say more about the origins of this specific pandemic? What do we know about its origins? Of course, many believe, as you've said, that it originated in bats. But explain how it moved from bats to humans. Was it at the Wuhan market? And what did that involve?
Yeah, we don't really know for sure, but we can trace back the origins by looking at the genetic signal within the virus itself. So we sequence out the gene from the virus, the genome, and then we compare it to others. And when we do that, we see that the viruses in people are the closest relative of those are from bats. This is not unusual. Bats happen to carry a lot of different viral species. There are many different bats around the world that carry their own viruses. We make contact with them. Often we don't see them. They fly at night, for instance, and we pick up their viruses. SARS coronavirus, the original virus, emerged from bats. Ebola virus is a bat origin virus. Rabies, and many others. How did a virus like this get from a bat to a human? It is a very strange thing when we try and think about it. But first of all, in Southeast Asia, there is a huge diversity of bats. People live out in rural areas close to bat caves. They're exposed every night when bats fly over them, urinate, defecate, maybe onto their food or into their drink. And people go into bat caves. People go in for various reasons. They're going to dig out the bat guano, the feces, and they use it as a fertilizer, just like we used to do many years ago with bird feces. They go into caves to shelter from the rain. They're farmers. They're subsistence farmers hunting and eating wildlife, so they get exposed that way. People do eat bats. It's true, and they eat bats all around the world. It's a free source of protein. If you're out there in a bat cave, they're pretty easy to catch. And these are the ways people get exposed. Now, how did it get into the market? We know for sure that the Wuhan market was part of this outbreak, but we think that the first few cases weren't in the market. And this is not uncommon. We've seen this with many, many other disease outbreaks, new viruses that emerge. They trickle out from rural areas through a person getting infected maybe in Yunnan province and then moving into Wuhan, that maybe they're part of the wildlife trade. Maybe a farmer got infected or a farmer's animals, and they were shipped into the markets. These wet markets aren't just places to sell wildlife. They're places where people congregate. They come in droves. They circulate around. They're really good places for a virus to spread. And if a person brings it in or an animal, that virus will spread. And it looks like that's what's happened here.
And could you also explain, you've talked about the environmental causes of this, what's called a virus spillover, like infectious diseases like COVID-19, causes such as environmental causes such as deforestation, the loss of biodiversity, and wildlife poaching. You've also said that people are developing a lot of new towns in this region of southwest China with a lot of high-speed train lines. And you warn that we're going to see more pandemics like this as long as such rampant development continues. So could you explain what the link is between development and the spread of these infectious diseases?
Well, we've done the science on this. We've been working on this for 20 years. We tracked every known emerging disease to its origin from the scientific literature. And then we tested with mathematical models what's driving that? What are the causes that could underlie the emergence of these new diseases? And what we find is they emerge in places where human populations are very dense and growing. They emerge in the tropics mainly because that's where the wildlife diversity is, and the viruses that become pandemic come from wildlife. And the other key factor is land use change. People moving into new areas, encroachment into wildlife habitat, building roads into a forest for a mine or for a logging camp. There are many, many examples of diseases like Ebola, SARS, and others, HIV itself from this. And that's a global trend that will drive the rise of future pandemics. Now, we're not saying that we've got to stop every modern aspect of development. We can do these things, but we need to do them in a smarter way, a more sustainable way. And we need to start treating pandemics as a risk of doing these things around the planet. We've got to reassess our relationship with the environment and reduce our ecological footprint. It's to the benefit of conservation. It'll reduce climate change. It will also stop us getting sick. And I think that's a really important point. For folks on the right who aren't interested in conservation or climate change, what about your own health? We are making ourselves sick by making the planet sick. And that's really the message that needs to come through from this. Because if we just treat this as another disease, wait for a vaccine, and then think, great, it's all over. Well, I've got news. There are 1.7 million more viruses out there that will be emerging in the future. We can either wait for them to emerge and get sick and have another global recession, or we can get out there and readdress our relationship with wildlife and make the planet a little bit healthier.
Let me ask you about a recent tweet, Dr. Daszak. You refute the widespread belief that COVID-19 is a black swan event, pointing to a 2013 Wired article that said, quote, there are bats carrying a virus that can directly infect people and cause another SARS pandemic. If you could comment on that, and also the idea that if this came from a virology lab, there are labs, of course, in China, there are labs in the United States. It doesn't have to be a conspiracy theory that released on the world, but the idea of perhaps there weren't the proper safety precautions or someone inside the lab somehow got infected. That can happen in any virology lab in the world.
Yeah, look, I mean, we've been raising the flag on these viruses ever since SARS, for 15 years. We went out to work in China with our colleagues out there with a specific goal of saying, where did SARS come from? It was an alarm call, SARS, because we had 8,000 people infected. 10% of them died, a very high death rate, but it didn't go to a true global pandemic like COVID-19. So we went out to China and we started looking into wildlife origins of this virus. And what we found was really surprising, a huge diversity, dozens, hundreds of bat origin coronaviruses. We found evidence that they were continually spilling over into people. We looked at rural populations in southwest China and found 3% of them had antibodies to these viruses. And we estimate that the exposure across Southeast Asia is about 1 to 7 million people a year, just by living in rural areas where bats live. So it's not just an expectation that we'll have more events. It's a certainty. And we started saying that. We looked at the viruses bats carried, and we showed that they can actually already infect human cells in the lab. They can cause disease, like SARS in some of the mouse models for SARS, and they evade the vaccines that were being developed at the time. And this is not unusual. You know, there are many other viruses. There are viruses related to Ebola that we don't know much about. We don't know if they infect people. There are viruses related to influenza out there that we don't know what they do in people. The way to deal with this is not to wait for them to emerge and make us sick. The way to do this is to get out there ahead of the curve, find out what's out there in wildlife, find out who's at risk, work with the people on the front line and reduce that risk. And you know, that's a really important public health message. It's also a really important message for international development. These viruses tend to emerge in poor countries in the tropics, just by the nature of where wildlife live. Countries that are less able to deal with outbreaks. So sending our taxpayer money to those countries is very unpopular with the current administration. But it not only protects them, it protects us. It's a right-wing agenda and a left-wing agenda. Now, on the issue of whether this could be a lab release, well, this is the problem with conspiracy theories, you know. It's impossible to say that it didn't happen. And it never will be possible. Even if you showed video evidence of every hour of everybody working in that lab, and there are video cameras up there. These are biosecure labs with very high-tech, sophisticated security systems. Even if you showed all the notebooks, the conspiracy folks would continue to say, well, it's a cover-up. Clearly something happened, and these are doctored notebooks, doctored videotapes. The point is that let's look at the balance of probability. That's what you have to do. We have a few hundred technicians and scientists working in these labs. They do not have a problem with staff or with security or with loose controls. These are very well-run labs. They've been inspected by the US CDC, by people working in BSL-4 labs, high-security labs in the US, in France, and internationally. They're accredited by the US. So it's ironic that now we're saying they're not very well organized. We actually inspected them properly and allowed them to open. You know, the cables that were reported in that... Sorry, yeah.
Dr. Daszak, if I may just interrupt, we only have a minute, and this is a question that we have to get to before we move to our next segment, which is on India. You know, there was widespread belief that COVID-19 would cause hundreds of thousands of deaths in the developing world, from India to Brazil, and that millions would be infected, but that's not yet happened. Your response to why that might be the case and whether we should expect something different in the future. We have a minute.
Well, yeah, look, rich countries test more. We can afford it. Poor countries don't. And what I expect is that there are a huge number of hidden community transmission in poorer countries around the world that is going to create an incredible problem in the future. Who's going to deal with that problem? Countries that can't afford to are going to seek support from their colleagues and their allies around the world. It's going to go through the WHO, the very organization we heard yesterday we're going to pull funding from. It's a travesty. And again, if we let that happen, we will see this outbreak continuing to cause problems in the developing world, and it won't go away, and it will affect us. We're never going to be free from a pandemic if we allow a virus to rage uncontrollably in countries that are out there with travelers coming back into the US. So again, it's misguided, it's short-sighted, and I really hope we address this quickly and aggressively, because I really feel that it's going to be impossible to do social distancing in the favelas of Rio and the slums and some of the places where people are already disenfranchised because they're considered illegal squatters. So there really are going to be issues around the world with this coronavirus in poorer countries, for sure.
Dr. Peter Daszak, we want to thank you so much for being with us. Disease ecologist, president of EcoHealth Alliance, a nonprofit that works globally to identify and study our vulnerabilities to emerging infectious disease. When we come back, we speak with the acclaimed author Arundhati Roy about the coronavirus in India and the political implications of the crisis. She says the pandemic is a portal. Stay with us.
Sukham pagaran
Medical workers in Kerala, India, dancing for their patients. Kerala is where our next guest, Arundhati Roy, was raised. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. We turn now to India, where officials say 6 major cities are coronavirus infection hotspots, calling them red zones, including the capital, New Delhi, and the financial center, Mumbai. The country has more than 420 deaths, 12,000 infections, though the number is likely far higher due to lack of testing. This comes as press freedom and civil liberties groups are sounding the alarm that the government of Narendra Modi is using the coronavirus outbreak to crack down on opponents and dissidents. This month, police arrested a prominent journalist, Siddharth Varanandram, accusing him of spreading discord and rumors after he reportedly criticized a Hindu nationalist politician for participating in a religious ceremony with dozens of people during the national lockdown. Elsewhere, activist Anand Talumde, who is 69 years old, and journalist Gautam Navlaka, who is 67, were arrested Tuesday over charges they both say were fabricated. Talumde wrote an open letter to the people of India on the eve of his arrest saying, quote, "I do not know when I shall be able to talk to you again. However, I earnestly hope that you will speak out before your turn comes," he said. Prime Minister Modi has announced India's nationwide coronavirus lockdown affecting 1.3 billion people, the largest at any time in the world, announced it'll be extended until May. In Mumbai, hundreds of migrant workers left homeless and unemployed by the lockdown held a protest Tuesday, demanding the government deliver food and assistance.
We are not getting anything here. The government promised to provide money and other amenities, but nothing has been delivered yet.
We have nothing to do now. We have small kids and they are not getting anything to eat. What should we do?
For more, we go to New Delhi, India, where we're joined by the award-winning writer, author, activist Arundhati Roy. She has a new essay in the Financial Times headlined, "The Pandemic is a Portal." It's drawn from her forthcoming book, Azadi, Freedom, Fascism, Fiction. Her most recent book is My Seditious Heart, collected nonfiction. She won the Booker Prize in 1997 for her first novel, The God of Small Things. Arundhati, welcome back to Democracy Now! As you speak to us from New Delhi, if you can talk about what's happening there and why you see the pandemic as a portal.
Well, in India, we have a COVID crisis whose contours we don't know yet. I mean, you mentioned the figures and also the fact that we don't know if they're reliable because there's not that much testing happening. But on the other hand, just looking around, that there isn't a run on hospitals like there has been in New York. The disease doesn't seem to have really got its claws into us yet. But we have the COVID crisis, we have a hunger crisis, we have a hatred crisis, and we have a health crisis apart from COVID. So, as you said, on the 24th of March, with 4 hours notice, which ran between 8 o'clock at night and 12 midnight, Modi locked down this nation of 1.38 billion people without warning. And the crisis that has created, the lack of planning, the lack of thinking forward, although like some states like Kerala, which you talked about, have done wonderful work, but from the center, the crisis has been exacerbated into something that might really become even more serious than the epidemic that it's planning for. You have a situation where you have millions of workers and migrant workers under a lockdown, which is supposed to enforce social distancing, but it only enforces physical compression. People are crammed together. People are separated from their families. In many places, they have no food. They have no access to money even. They've sold their phones. you have the sense that you're sitting on some kind of explosive substance. And yet at the same time, like you said, arrests are being made, not just the people who you mentioned. Siddharth Varadarajan has not been arrested, the editor of Wire, but he has a case filed against him. Senior lawyers who speak out against Modi have had FIRs filed against them. Gautam Navlakha and Anand Teldumde have been arrested. Young students and people, a lot of Muslims who are now being accused of being part of the massacre that took place against Muslims in Northeast Delhi are being arrested. The circles are closing in. And the reason I said that the pandemic is a portal is that all over the world you have a situation now where, on the one hand, the powers that be are going to try and increase surveillance, increase inequality, increase privatization, increase control. And on the other hand, you have populations of people who will want to increase solidarity and who will want to see and understand the fact that what has happened in the US as well as what has happened in India is that the pandemic has exposed structural problems of such egregious injustice and inequality. Even the calling of the shutdown in 4 hours notice was a sign of panic from this prime minister, because he knows that this infrastructure of this country, it can't even deal with normality, forget about a pandemic.
And Arundhati, I want to ask you more about that, about Modi's declaration, this of a lockdown with just 4 hours notice. He declared it at 8 p.m. and it went into effect at midnight on March 24th. But the first case, reported case of COVID-19 was on January 30th. So it's unclear why he took 7 weeks to shut down the country. But you went when the country went into lockdown, you used a press pass and you went and spoke to some of the migrants, the hundreds of thousands of people who were forced to flee Delhi once all transportation had already been shut down. You spoke to some of these migrants in Delhi. Can you tell us what they said about their situation?
Well, as soon as the lockdown was announced, mass transport was stopped. It was the last week of March. People had not been paid their salaries. People who live virtually from day to day. The landlords in these little cramped medieval tenements into which 5 and 10 people are squashed into a room said that they wanted their rent on time. So people just had to leave, and it was a surreal sight, while there was no traffic on the streets, but suddenly, the structural inequality and the horror, the shame of how our societies live made themselves manifest, and I just realized that these people have started walking for hundreds of kilometers to their villages. And I went out because I felt like the tectonic plates were shifting, it was crazy. So I went to the border between Delhi and Uttar Pradesh, where I walked with many of them, and I spoke to many of them, including Muslims who had just survived this horrific kind of wannabe pogrom against them, which didn't turn out that way because people were so prepared that they fought back. But having survived that, now they were walking these hundreds of miles home, all, carpenters, tailors, construction workers. And all of them were aware of the virus. All of them were wearing masks. They were doing their best to maintain social distance. It was impossible. There was a rumor that buses might be organized, and suddenly like 100,000 people were there together, pressed together, waiting for buses. And I asked some of them, so, what do you think of this virus? They said, whatever we think of the virus, right now we have no food, we have no water, we have nowhere to sleep, we have to reach home. And that was so much more present for them than this. A lot of them felt that, this was a rich people's illness brought in by planes. Why didn't they stop people at the airport instead of kicking us out of our jobs and our homes, And a lot of people one of the people who I wrote about in the Financial Times piece he just said to me, Shayad Modi ji ko hamare bare mein pata nahi, meaning maybe Modi doesn't know about us, which was just perhaps true in a way, that the government, and everybody else who controls anything in this society has more or less airbrushed the poor out of their imagination, out of films, out of literature, out of everything, except NGO brochures where the poor feature in order to raise money,
Arundhati, I wanted to ask you about President Trump's critical trip to India right at the time the pandemic was exploding. The famous pictures of them shaking hands, the stadium of 100,000 people. When President...
No, 1 million people.
Oh, sorry.
In India, and it was 1 million people.
So
in the U.S., it was 50,000, yeah.
So as President Trump took off and was flying back to the United States, it was then that he read the comments of U.S. scientists talking about the effects of the pandemic and what will mean in the United States. He was so enraged by what she had to say that he canceled a meeting of scientists when he was returning in retaliation. And then you have this whole relationship with India around hydroxychloroquine, what Dr. Trump, and I'm saying that very facetiously, President Trump has been pushing hydroxychloroquine because Narendra Modi said he was going to crack down on exports of this drug until President Trump pressured him. And now one study after another is coming out saying people are dying in the studies around hydroxychloroquine. Just overall, talk about what Trump has meant for Modi and what Modi means for Trump, this U.S.-India alliance and what it's doing in your country.
Well, it is giving such a great amount of legitimacy to a situation which I can't hardly explain, Amy, on TV, because I've been writing about this for so long, and what I said earlier, the crisis of hunger, and then the crisis of hatred. So the time Modi came to the U.S. and did the Howdy Modi show, and then when Trump came here, and it was the Namaste Trump and so on, this sort of bizarre dance between these two, I'm sorry to say, but not very intelligent human beings, but very, very powerful people who are legitimizing the horror of what is happening in the U.S. with immigrants, with racism, with undocumented workers, and the horror of what the BJP regime, the RSS, which is the mothership of the BJP cultural guild to which Modi belongs, which believes that India should be a Hindu nation and that everyone else should be second-class citizens, towards which they have made new citizenship laws and are building detention centers. And all of this is being legitimized by this idea that the most powerful country in the world and the most powerful man in the world loves Modi, and between them, it's a tragedy for the world that this particular pandemic has arrived at a time when country after country is controlled by people like this, which is why I said it's a portal, because are we gonna sleepwalk into this fascist surveillance state that everyone has in store for us? I mean, the app called the Arogya Setu app, which Modi has asked people to download and became the fastest downloaded app in the world. We have 50 million downloads now. I mean, every technical expert says it's just a surveillance app, and all various, so many democratic societies are moving towards this in this panic and fear that has been created. And there are so many things about the coronavirus, so many heartwarming things. I was reading in the New York Times today how how it's creating solidarity between people in the US. I just saw a wonderful video of people thanking a Pakistani doctor for having invented a mechanism that allows a single ventilator to be shared by many. But here you have Muslims being blamed for corona. There's the whole concept of corona jihad. And I've been reading of how in the 1930s, the Nazi state basically blamed Jews for typhus and used it as a way of stigmatizing and ghettoizing Jews. The same thing is happening here with Muslims. You know, you have to hear the language that the mainstream media uses and people on the street, you know. So it's a extremely dangerous situation, which is being completely legitimized by Trump and by all these powerful people who meet and shake hands and refuse to see how this virus is going to move in and exacerbate inequalities, exacerbate injustice, and create a situation where they too are frightened because they know these millions of people hungry, starving. How are you going to deal with that anger? In India, I'll tell you how they're going to deal with it. They're going to try and divert it into an anti-Muslim rage, which is the only thing they do always. But at some point, you know, already things are exploding. People are, you know, burning shelters and so on. And the hunger is so urgent. It has to be addressed now. The granaries are full of food which is not being distributed. You know, people need cash transfers, but they don't have bank accounts or they don't have access to their bank accounts. It's a crisis which you feel you're sitting on some kind of explosive substance right now. And, you know, as it deepens, once you distribute that grain, where will the next batch of food come from? Because right now is the harvest season. And, you know, people are, even those who are being able to harvest are not being able to sell. And you know, the whole cropping pattern of this country has changed into
Arundhati, we have 10
crops.
seconds.
Yep. Tell me.
We just have, I want to thank you very much for being with us as we run out of time. We're going to link to your piece, The Pandemic as a Portal, that's in Foreign Policy. Arundhati Roy is next Thursday, April 23rd, will be joining an online teach-in with Princeton professor Imani Perry and Haymarket Books on The Pandemic is a Portal. And we'll link to your essays as well at democracynow.org. Democracy Now! Is working with as few people on site as possible. The majority of our amazing team is working from home. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Be safe.